Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Sam, and today I'm going to be talking through all the books that I read in October. In total, I read 12 books in October. I'm hoping that I've counted that right, but of all the books that I read in October, most of them were 4 or 5 star reads. I think I had one book that was 2 stars, but otherwise I loved pretty much every book that I read, which is great. I have a feeling that this video might end up being quite long, so what I'm going to do is I'll try and keep it as quick as possible, but I'll also leave timestamps in the description, so if there's a particular book or books that you're interested in, then you can skip ahead if you want to. If you're also interested in seeing what books I'm planning to read in November, then I'll also leave a link on screen and in the description to my November TBR, so you can check that out too if you haven't already. Okay, so the first book that I read in October was The Kiss Quotient by Helen Hoang, and this follows a woman called Stella who has Asperger's, and she's I think about 30, and she's reached that age where her mom in particular is starting to put a bit of pressure on her to settle down and find a husband. However, Stella has convinced herself that she is bad at sex and relationships, and so she has this idea of hiring a male escort called Michael to help her with the things that she thinks that she's bad at. And the book kind of goes from there. It's a romance, so you can probably guess what happens, but this is basically a role reversal of the film Pretty Woman, and I absolutely loved it. I gave it 4 stars. I think that if you're looking for a romance book that's kind of super steamy, but also has like cute and sweet moments, then I think that this is perfect. Michael and Stella as characters were just so cute together, and I found it really heartbreaking how Stella has had some really awful experiences with men in the past, and she blamed herself when really all she needed was a bit of understanding, and it was really lovely to see how Michael was able to be that for her. The only reason I couldn't give this 5 stars is because there's a little bit of miscommunication towards the end, which I could kind of understand because it was born from the insecurities of the characters, and so it kind of made sense within the context of the story. But in general, I don't really like miscommunication in books, but it didn't take away from like my overall enjoyment. I still absolutely loved this book, and I would definitely recommend it. The next book that I read was Blue Lily by Maggie Stiefvater, and I also this month read The Raven King by Maggie Stiefvater. So these are books 3 and 4, like the last 2 books in the Raven Cycle series, which I've been reading since the summer. And this series is really hard to explain, but I'm going to have a go. So it follows a group of friends who live in this town, and they're trying to find this Welsh king that has supposedly been hidden somewhere in the town. There's also like psychics and ley lines and stuff, and it feels very mythical and very atmospheric, and the best way I can think to describe this series is that it's like being in a dream, which if you've read the series then you might kind of see what I'm trying to say there. Nothing is ever really outright explained, and I think that for that reason, if you're going to read this series, then you need to have quite a bit of patience, because for most of this series I did not have a clue what was going on. The story builds up gradually over time, and it's very much a character focused story. The first book I liked, the second book I enjoyed slightly more, and then books 3 and 4 I actually really enjoyed, and I think it's because I was a little bit more attached to the characters. I think that especially in this book I was able to better understand the nuances between the characters and their relationships. I think that's the right word. Going into the final book, I was really hoping that all of the loose ends would be tied up, and I wouldn't say that I was really disappointed with the ending. I think that for most of this book I was absolutely loving it, and I was convinced that it was going to be like 5 stars, but right towards the end it almost felt like the story had given up. We'd spent 4 books kind of building up to this main event, and it didn't really follow through. It felt very rushed, and I didn't hate it, but I also think that it could have been a lot more satisfying. I don't know, I still feel really confused about this series in general, and I don't think that it's one of my favourite young adult fantasy series, but I did appreciate it for what it was, and I did really enjoy it overall. The next 2 books that I read were for a reading vlog where I read the oldest and the newest horror books on my TBR, because it's October and I felt like scaring the crap out of myself. But the first book that I read for that vlog was Misery by Stephen King. This follows a best-selling author who is really quite famous, and he is in a car accident and he's rescued by a woman who claims to be his #1 fan, and she ends up keeping him hostage in her home and forces him to rewrite the ending to one of his most famous book series. I won't say too much about this book because I did talk about it quite in detail in my reading vlog, but I think this book is really good if you're new to Stephen King and you're interested in reading Stephen King but you haven't read any of his books before. It's quite grim and quite gruesome in places, but I really liked the way that the tension was built up throughout the book. I really liked the way that the characters felt very real, and I think that it was genuinely horrifying, which is what you want in a horror book, like you want it to be horrifying. The next book that I read, which was also for that reading vlog, was The Other People by C.J. Tudor, and this follows a man who is driving home one evening and he notices in the car in front through the back window a little girl that looks a lot like his daughter, and he pulls over at the next services to call home and check on his wife and daughter, and the police answer and they tell him that his wife and daughter are dead. And the rest of the book kind of follows him as he tries to work out the truth, because he's convinced that he has just seen his little girl in the car in front, and so the police must be wrong. This book was a lot more fast-paced than I was expecting, and I have read The Chalk Man, which is also by C.J. Tudor. I read that earlier this year and really enjoyed that too. I think that this book, you can tell that her writing has really grown, and although there were parts that I kind of guessed, it didn't take away from my overall enjoyment, and I finished it within a day. It was a lot shorter than I was expecting. I think it's around 300 pages. I gave this 4 stars and it was almost a 5-star read, but there was this weird supernatural element to the story that I didn't think was really needed, and I didn't feel like it added anything to the story. I think if that hadn't been in there, then this would have been a 5-star read. I think that if you like thrillers and you enjoy thrillers and you're looking for a book that kind of bridges the gap between thriller and horror, then C.J. Tudor's books are really, really good and I would recommend them. The next book that I read was People of Abandoned Character by Clare Whitfield, and this is historical fiction set in the late 1800s, and it follows a woman called Susanna who moved to London to become a nurse. However, she ended up meeting and marrying this wealthy doctor, and to start with they seem to have quite a good relationship. However, pretty much as soon as their honeymoon is over, he changed and he became quite violent towards her, and he started to stay out quite late at night, and sometimes he wouldn't come home at all. When the newspapers start to report on these murders that are happening in Whitechapel, our main character Susanna starts to suspect that her husband might be this man that they're calling Jack the Ripper. This book only came out at the start of October, and I requested an ARC through NetGalley because it sounded really interesting, and I'm trying to get more into historical fiction. I was actually really surprised by how much I liked this book. I think it's a debut novel and it didn't read like that at all. I felt like the writing was really engaging and I was definitely invested in the story, especially because there was that kind of mystery element to it. There's a few trigger warnings for this book that I'll leave in the description if you wanted to check those out, but it went towards the end in a direction that I wasn't expecting, and I'm still not sure whether I fully understood what happened. It was a little bit confusing, but I still gave it 4 stars, and I would recommend it if you're looking for historical fiction that's set during that time period. The next book that I read was The Vanishing Half by Bennett, which is literary fiction, I think you would call it, and I read an interview with the author where she spoke about how she came up with the inspiration for this book. She was talking to her mom who grew up in Louisiana, and her mom told her about these black communities where the people would deliberately intermarry with the intention of making sure that future generations had lighter and lighter skin. And the book follows these twin sisters called Desiree and Stella, who grew up in a town just like this, and they are very light skinned to the point where they could pass for being white, and they ran away from home when they were 16. And the book picks up many years later where one of the twins, Desiree, has just returned to their hometown with her dark-skinned daughter, and she lost touch with Stella many years ago because Stella decided to start living her life as a white woman. The book initially follows Desiree as she leaves her abusive husband and returns to her hometown with her daughter, and then the perspective kind of switches, so we're following her daughter Jude, and then eventually Stella and her daughter Kennedy, their perspectives are also kind of weaved into the story. I felt like this book was quite slow to get started, and I don't know whether it's maybe because the chapters were quite big, but as soon as the perspective switched to Jude's perspective, I found that I was really drawn into the story. I thought it was really interesting how the book showed the huge contrast between the 2 sisters, who were really close when they were growing up because they were twins, and I thought it was really interesting how it showed the different paths that they've taken and the effect that that had on their daughters. The ending did feel a little abrupt to me, but otherwise I could not fault this book, and I gave it 5 stars. And I think that if you like slow-paced, character-driven novels, then I would definitely recommend this. The next book that I read was The Nightingale by Kristin, which follows two sisters living in France during World War II. We have Vianne, I think that's how you pronounce it, who's the older sister, and she's the kind of person who follows the rules and keeps her head down. We then have Isabel, who is 18 at the start of the book and is a bit of a rebel. I am so annoyed at myself for putting off reading this for so long because people told me that it was amazing and people told me that it would probably make me cry. And did I listen to them? I thought, no, there is no way that it's going to live up to that hype. But I am happy to say that it was amazing and it did make me cry, and it has become one of my favourite books that I've read this year. Even though I've read quite a few books that are set during World War II, I'd never read a book that was set during France in World War II, and there were certain parts of the book, or there were certain parts of history that were incorporated into the book that I hadn't heard of before and that I didn't know anything about. France was occupied by Germany quite early on in the war, and what I didn't realise was that French civilians, the French people, quite often had to take in German soldiers and allow them to live in their homes. And this is kind of shown in the book because the sisters live in a village in France that has been occupied by the Germans, and where they are having to kind of accommodate them and feed them and give them a place to stay. One of the things that I liked about this book was the way that it showed the contrast between the two sisters and the very different choices that they make, because Vianne has a husband who's gone away to the war and she's got a young daughter, and so she feels like her best option to keep her family safe is to keep her head down and just do what the soldiers are asking her to, whereas Isabel actively joins the resistance and plays quite a big part in that. The book spans the entire length of the war, and it does get progressively more sad the more that the story goes on. Towards the end, even though it's quite a long book, I couldn't put it down and I finished it within a few days. There were a few little inconsistencies throughout the book, however the ending, I kind of predicted a little bit about what was going to happen, but I was not expecting it to have that much of an emotional impact on me, and I cried, like I sobbed my little heart out. I was an absolute mess, and for that reason I had to give it 5 stars. The next book that I read was The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien, which is the first book in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and I read this for the Tolkien Along Read Along, which is Lord of the Rings Read Along being hosted by Beth, Ashley and Lauren. I'll leave a link to the announcement videos in the description if you wanted to check that out, but I was really nervous to read this because I've read The Lord of the Rings once before when I was a kid, but I was really excited to read it as an adult and see how it compared to my memory. I'm sure most people know what Lord of the Rings is about, but if you don't, it follows a hobbit called Frodo Baggins who goes on this quest, this journey to destroy the Ring of Power before it gets into the hands of the Dark Lord Sauron, who wants to use it for evil. It's set in this world called Middle-earth where you have all of these different creatures. You have men, you have hobbits, you have elves, you have dwarves. And this book to me just felt so magical. Like, I wasn't expecting to love it as much as I did. Because I was a little bit nervous about reading it, I split the book into sections. So I told myself that I would read 50 pages a day, and I did find that that was manageable. There were some days where I read slightly less, and then there were some days where I read slightly more because I was just in the zone and I wanted to keep on reading. I don't know whether it's just because this is the first book in the series or whether it's just Tolkien's writing in general, but I did find this very, very slow, which I was expecting because I could kind of remember it being like that. But what you do get in the books that you don't get in the film adaptations is a lot more of the history of Middle-earth. It feels very mythical and whimsical. For example, there's lots of poems and songs dotted throughout the book, and sometimes these did drag a little bit because they take up like quite a large chunk. But there were moments where I was reading this and I just felt this like overwhelming sense of like comfort. I think because I grew up with the films and I loved the characters so much and just that world in general, that reading this, it was almost like a drawn out, slower paced version of the movies. And just in general, it gave me that warm, fuzzy feeling. And there was a moment during the Mines of Moria, which if you've seen the films or you've read the books, then you might be able to know what bit I'm talking about. But I cried, and I don't remember crying watching the film, but reading the book, I don't know whether I just felt more of an emotional attachment to the characters, but it did have like a pretty big emotional impact on me. Lord of the Rings does have a reputation for being quite intimidating, but actually reading this as an adult, I have read quite a lot of adult fantasy series that were much more dense and harder to get into in comparison to Lord of the Rings. I think that if you're wanting to read this and you're used to reading slow-paced adult fantasy, then I don't think you'll struggle with this. I think that it is a lot easier to get into than its reputation reputation implies. The next book that I read was My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell, and this is, I think, described as literary fiction, and it follows a woman called Vanessa who is in her 30s, and when she was 15 she had this relationship with her 42-year-old English teacher. And there are two timelines that you follow throughout the book. You follow Vanessa as a teenager and also Vanessa as an adult, where another woman who's a few years younger than her has accused the same teacher of sexual abuse. And Vanessa has always denied that she was a victim. She's always maintained that their relationship was this great love affair. However, in the present day, we see how much the abuse has impacted on her life. I found it really hard to rate and review this book because on the one hand, I found it really powerful and I couldn't fault the writing. However, I would feel really uncomfortable if someone chose to pick up this book based on my recommendation. This book has had so much hype and I can definitely see why. However, I feel like if you're planning to read this book, then you need to know and understand what you're getting yourself into, because there are parts where it's quite graphic and where it doesn't hold back. And because it's told in the first person perspective, you get to see inside Vanessa's mind and you get to see how she experiences and interprets certain events. For example, there's a few moments throughout the book where she is so disgusted by this man, but then a few moments later she'll be convincing herself that he must love her. And it was so heartbreaking seeing how he was manipulating her. It was really difficult to read at times, and I think if I had to summarise this book in one word, it would be unnerving, because even though it's fiction, it felt like I was reading about a real person's experience. The next book that I read, which I actually finished this morning or this afternoon, was Get a Life, Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert. This is a steamy adult romance book about a woman called Chloe Brown who has a chronic illness, and at the very start of the book she is almost hit by a car, and it makes her start to reevaluate her life and kind of think about the things that she has done. And she makes this list of things that she wants to do with her life to help her get a life, like in the title, if that makes sense. She basically feels like life has been passing her by and she wants to change that. And one of the first things that she does is move out into her own apartment, and she moves into this apartment building where she meets Red, who is the superintendent of this apartment building where she's living. And the story kind of goes from there, but I absolutely loved the chemistry between these two main characters. It's kind of like an enemies to lovers, because they're not very good friends when they first meet. They don't really like each other, but it's kind of like they just snip at each other and they kind of tease each other. And as their relationship grew and they started to get to know each other better, they started to open up to each other more. And there were moments where I felt like I was going to cry, like it was quite emotional. Quite a big part of the book is showing how much Chloe's chronic pain impacts on her life and on her relationship with Red. And I really appreciated that being part of the book. I think that representation is so important. I also really loved the relationship between the three sisters. So Chloe has two younger sisters, and I think that there's another book in this series that follows Chloe's younger sister Danny, and I think there's another book coming out this year or next year that follows the youngest sister Eve, and so I definitely want to get around to reading those at some point. I gave this 4 or 4.5 stars because I did love it. However, there was something that happened about 80 to 90% of the way through the book that I didn't think was needed. I think that if it was going to be included, then it should have been brought forward and should have happened much sooner, rather than right at the end of the book, because I felt like it kind of broke up the pace in a not very good way. Otherwise, I really loved this book and I would definitely recommend it if you're looking for a quick, steamy romance. The final book that I read kind of on and off throughout October was City of Bones by Cassandra Clare. I listened to this as an audiobook and I got it for free through my library. I used the BorrowBox app, and I'd never read anything by Cassandra Clare before, but I know that The Mortal Instruments is a really popular young adult fantasy series. This book follows a teenage girl called Clare who lives in New York City, and she goes out one evening to this club with her friend Simon, where she learns about the existence of shadow hunters who are demon hunters. And she ends up getting mixed up in this world, and the book kind of goes from there. As I think I've mentioned, this is the first book that I've ever read by Cassandra Clare, and I quite liked the audiobook actually. The audiobook was really entertaining. The narrator was very enthusiastic and kind of what I would have expected for a YA fantasy. My main issue with this book was that it was so predictable, and I pretty much guessed the entire plot within the first few chapters, and it got to a point where where I was getting quite annoyed because halfway through or partway through, something is revealed. And when I heard that, I thought, okay, so this must also be true. But none of the characters picked up on it, and I was thinking, surely one of you must even just want to ask that question. There was something that was revealed towards the end, like a twist that I knew was coming only because I'd seen like a half spoiler on Twitter and I'd kind of worked it out. I think that if I hadn't seen that, then there was no way that I would have guessed that, because who would guess that? Because it was so predictable, I feel like I've already predicted what's going to happen in the rest of the series. I feel like I've read so many books like that before, and I didn't feel that connected to the characters that I would want to continue reading about them. I know that I've been quite negative about this book. I gave it 2 stars in the end, but I am really glad that I read it, because at least now I can say that I've read a Cassandra Clare book, I've read the first book of The Mortal Instruments, and I've decided it's just not for me. Okay, so those are all the books that I read in October. Thanks for watching if you've made it this far. I feel like I've been filming for a really long time. It's actually gone dark outside, which it wasn't when I started this video, but hopefully you enjoyed it. And if you have read any of the books that I mentioned, please do leave me a comment down below. Let me know what you thought of them. Let me know if you agreed with what I said. And yeah, if you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Click subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.